The assassin moved through the ventilation shaft like smoke, silent, patient, and absolutely certain no one had seen him enter. He was wrong. Sergeant First Class Dara Voss had clocked the thermal bloom in Section 7-4 the moment she stepped onto the vessel of unbroken sky, the HFY Royal flagship. She hadn't said anything. She'd simply repositioned herself 3 meters closer to the Queen's chamber door and waited, right hand loose at her side, eyes tracking every shadow on the ceiling. The HFY Royal Court had not wanted a human guardian. They'd made that clear in 17 different ways over the past 6 hours, through silence, through posture, through the slow, deliberate way the High Chamberlain had handed her credentials back after scanning them, as if returning something contaminated. HFY stood nearly 2 meters tall on average, with iridescent carapace along their shoulders and necks, compound eyes that caught light like broken mirrors, and a cultural history that stretched back 40,000 years. They had guarded their own queen since before humans had discovered fire. And now a human, a small human, by their standards, stood outside the chrysalis chamber of Queen Apparent Velith, third of her name, age approximately 11 by human developmental equivalency, and the last surviving heir to the HFY sovereign bloom. Dara didn't care about the politics. She cared about the ceiling. The thermal signature moved again, slow, disciplined, trained. Whoever was in that shaft had done this before. They were angling toward the secondary grate, which opened directly above the chrysalis alcove where the young queen slept. Dara pressed her earpiece once. One click. The signal for imminent threat, hold position. She didn't want the court guards rushing in and spooking whoever was up there into acting early. She needed them to come down on her terms, not theirs. The grate shifted, barely a millimeter. Dara's eyes didn't move to it. She counted. 3 seconds. The grate dropped. The assassin came through fast, a HFY male in neutralizing mesh, limbs folded tight for the fall, blade already extended in the lower right grip configuration that meant priority elimination, close quarters. He was good. He'd timed his drop for the 2-second window between guard rotations. What he hadn't accounted for was that Dara hadn't rotated. She caught his leading wrist before he fully extended, used his own downward momentum to torque the joint past its rotation limit, and drove his face into the floor with the kind of controlled force that said, "I've done this 1,000 times and I will do it 1,000 more." The blade skidded across the polished deck. She had her knee in his back and his arms locked before he'd registered the impact. It was over in under 2 seconds. The Queen's chamber door opened. A small face appeared in the gap, enormous compound eyes, the pale iridescent tone of a HFY child who hadn't yet reached chromatic maturity, antennae trembling with what Dara had already learned meant acute alertness. Queen Apparent Velith stood in her sleeping robes and stared at the subdued assassin on the floor, then at the human kneeling calmly on his back. "You are loud," Velith said. Dara looked at her. "Your radiance, please return inside." "You are loud for someone who is small." "Inside, your radiance." The young queen tilted her head, both antennae curving forward in the HFY gesture. "Dara had been briefed meant I am deciding whether you are interesting." Then she stepped back and let the door close. Court guards arrived 40 seconds later. They took the assassin with the kind of rigid efficiency that suggested they were furious and had no acceptable outlet for it. High Chamberlain Orsval arrived 90 seconds after that, his carapace flushed a deep amber, the HFY equivalent of a jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. He looked at the mark on the floor where the assassin had impacted. He looked at Dara. She said nothing. He said nothing. He left. Dara remained at her post. She pulled the grate back up, secured it with 2 of her own polymer ties, the one she always carried because in 15 years of protective detail she had learned that vents were always the problem, and returned to her position beside the door. Inside, she could hear the young queen moving around. Probably not sleeping. That was fine. Dara wasn't sleeping either. What she was doing was running through the next 12 hours in her mind, cataloguing what she'd seen about the ship's layout, the guard rotation gaps, the Chamberlain's body language when he'd handed back her credentials, and the specific way the assassin had angled his blade, not for a quick kill. For a harvest cut. Ceremonial. Someone hadn't just wanted Velith dead. Someone wanted to send a message with how she died. That changed everything. By morning, ship cycle morning, the lighting shifting from deep amber to pale gold through the corridor membranes, Dara had 3 pages of handwritten notes, 2 requests for structural schematics submitted through official channels she fully expected to be denied, and a precise count of 17 distinct moments when the court's own security had failed to cover angles she'd identified within her first hour board. She submitted the notes through the formal liaison channel anyway. Protocol required it. Whether anyone read them was their problem. The chrysalis chamber opened at the 7th bell of morning cycle. Velith emerged in formal day robes, attended by 2 Cathare handmaidens who moved with the synchronized precision of people who had rehearsed every step. The young queen walked to the end of the corridor, turned, walked back. Morning constitutional. Dara had read about it in the briefing documents. Catharo royalty historically used the morning walk to survey their immediate domain, an instinct so old it predated the concept of ships entirely. Dara walked behind her and, to the left, 2 paces back, eyes everywhere except on Velith. You wrote things in the night, Velith said without turning. Dara kept pace. Yes, your radiance. What things? Observations. The young queen's antennae curved back, the I am waiting configuration. Observations about what? Security gaps. Dara paused, because she'd decided in the night that honesty was the only viable strategy here. 17 of them. In the first hour. Both antennae went fully upright. That one wasn't in the briefing documents, but the meaning was obvious enough. 17. 17 that I'm confident about. Possibly more. Velith stopped walking. Her handmaidens stopped precisely with her, like shadows with impeccable timing. The young queen turned, fully, deliberately, in the way that Dara had already catalogued as meaning this is a formal attention. Compound eyes caught the gold morning light and scattered it into a dozen small reflections. The court believes, Velith said carefully, that you are here because no Cathara guardian of sufficient rank was available on short notice, and that your assignment is an insult poorly disguised as a solution. Yes, your radiance. Is that what you believe? Dara met those compound eyes without flinching. I believe someone used a harvest configuration blade last night. That's not a standard assassination protocol. That's ritual. Someone in your court, or connected to it, authorized a message killing, which means this isn't about removing you, it's about destabilizing the Sovereign Bloom's legitimacy through the manner of your death. She kept her voice level, factual, the same tone she'd use reading a weather report. That's what I believe. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Velith turned and resumed her walk. You will attend my morning council. That's not within my assigned role, your radiance. I am reassigning your role. One of the handmaidens made a soft sound, distress, Dara guessed, or warning. Protocol strictly governed who attended royal council. A foreign guardian had never done so. The court would consider it a contamination of sacred process. Your radiance, Dara said, that will create significant friction with Chamberlain Orsval. Yes, said Velith, with the particular flatness of someone who had already calculated the cost and decided to pay it. It will. Dara said nothing more. She filed the moment carefully in her mind. The young queen, 11 years old by human equivalency, last heir to a dynasty 40,000 years old, walking calmly forward with her antennae level and her spine perfectly straight, already learning that every step towards survival costs something. Dara kept 2 paces back and to the left. Her eyes kept moving. Orsval's amber flush returned the moment they entered the council chamber. The room was built for Cathare scale, high vaulted ceilings, curved walls inlaid with 40 generations of sovereign seals in iridescent resin, seating arrangements that followed hierarchy as precisely as mathematics. 6 senior court officials stood at their designated positions. They had clearly been mid-discussion when the door opened, because the silence that followed had the specific quality of words cut short. Every compound eye in the room moved to Dara. She stood at her position, behind and to the left of Velith's chair, and was still. Orsval spoke in Cathare, which she understood at roughly 70% comprehension. The gist was, this presence is irregular, the guardian station is outside the door, protocol forbids. Velith sat down, arranged her robes with unhurried precision, and said in Galactic Common, clearly for Dara's benefit, which was itself a political act, my guardian remains. We have business about last night's breach. Another silence. This one with texture, the kind where everyone in the room was calculating simultaneously. The eldest council member, a female whose carapace had gone the deep violet of extreme age, spoke. Also in Galactic Common. The breach has been addressed. The perpetrator is in custody. The perpetrator, Dara said, because Velith's slight antenna turn in her direction was permission enough, used a harvest configuration. I'd like to know who in this room is familiar with that designation. The temperature of the silence changed entirely. 2 of the 6 council members went very still in the way that meant involuntary response, suppressed. The Violet Elder's carapace shifted, a fractional color change toward grey that Dara had learned overnight meant controlled anger, not guilt. Orzval's amber deepened. The remaining 3 showed nothing readable, which was itself information. 2 had reacted. Dara noted their positions, their names from the briefing, secondary legged hound DRA, and the keeper of the Sovereign Archive, a male named Cerevel whose file had been so thoroughly uninteresting that she'd almost skipped it. Almost. She kept her face neutral. Velith sat at the head of the council table and said, very quietly, "Someone in my court authorized a ritual killing of a child." She let that sentence stand alone in the air for a long moment. I would like to understand why before I decide what happens next. The council chamber was very quiet. Outside, the ship moved through space at standard cruise velocity, and, somewhere in the security brig, a hired blade was sitting with 2 locked wrists wondering how a human that small had put him on the floor so fast. Dara watched Cerevel's hands. They were completely motionless, the specific kind of motionless that takes practice. She'd seen that before. In a man who'd tried to kill a diplomat in Istanbul 10 years ago. He'd held his hands exactly that still right up until the moment he'd decided to run. She shifted her weight to her forward foot and waited. Cerevel ran on the 3rd day. Not physically. He was too disciplined for that. He ran in the way that experienced court conspirators ran. He tried to destroy evidence, isolate witnesses, and create a version of events that would reach the Kethara judicial bloom before anyone else's version did. He had a 12-hour head start arranged through a communication channel so deeply embedded in the ship's ancient architecture that the security team had never thought to audit it. He'd had it prepared for months. What he hadn't prepared for was Dara having identified the channel on day 1. She'd found it the same way she found everything, by reading the room, watching the patterns, noticing that the archive section of the ship had precisely 1 more communication relay than the ship schematic showed. She'd flagged it in her notes. She'd submitted those notes through the formal liaison channel that everyone had ignored. Except Velith. The young queen had read every word. Dara had found that out at the end of day 2, when Velith had asked, with careful casualness, what a redundant relay node was and why it would matter. Dara had explained. Velith had listened with both antennae curved forward in the I am deciding whether you are interesting configuration that Dara was beginning to think actually meant something closer to I am deciding whether I can trust you. On day 3, when Cerevel activated his channel, the message went nowhere. The channel had been quietly closed 18 hours earlier, on the Queen Apparent's personal authorization. Dara wasn't in the room when Orzval delivered that information to the archive keeper. She didn't need to be. She watched from the corridor through a security feed on her handheld scanner as a 40-year court official processed the reality that his escape route had been sealed by an 11-year-old who'd been briefed by a human guardian everyone had dismissed as a temporary insult. His hands stopped being still. Velith called the formal council session 4 hours later. The chamber was the same. The seating arrangements were the same. The 40 generations of sovereign seals still gleamed in the walls. Cerevel sat at his position, because running was no longer an option and remaining was the only play that might yet salvage something. Houndiere sat beside him, and the slight angle of her carapace toward him, barely a degree, told Dara everything about which of them had been primary and which had been convinced. Orzval stood at the chamber's formal witness position. His amber flush had faded to something close to his natural tone. He had spent 3 days being furious at a human guardian and had arrived, apparently, at something more complicated. The Violet Elder, First Council Erethene, whose file Dara had read 4 times because experience read as authority and authority read as power, sat with her hands folded and her carapace perfectly neutral. Velith entered. The room went still. She was 11 years old by human developmental equivalency, and she walked to her chair like she'd been born for nothing else, because she had, and she sat down, and she did not rush, and she did not perform. She looked at Cerevel for a long moment. Then, she said, "Tell me why." He told her. It took 40 minutes. Dara listened without moving. The political architecture of the conspiracy was old, decades old, seated in the reign of Velith's mother, growing through the transition, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Cerevel had not wanted chaos. He'd wanted a different heir, one he'd had a hand in shaping. A harvest kill would have delegitimized the sovereign bloom, triggered a succession dispute, and opened a window he'd spent 30 years preparing to climb through. He spoke in the flat tone of someone who has accepted the room. When he finished, Velith was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "And, Houndier." "Believed the bloom was better served by a more manageable heir," Cerevel said, without heat. "A simple fact, delivered. She was wrong. I told her this would be the outcome. That I would survive. That the human would prevent it." He glanced at Dara, the first time he'd acknowledged her presence directly since the first council session. "I underestimated the assignment." The room breathed. Velith turned to Erithene. First Council. Recommendation. The Violet Elder spoke for 3 minutes in formal Cathere. Dara caught about 80% of it. The recommendation was the expected one: formal severance, judicial transfer, the weight of sovereign law applied with the precision of 40,000 years of practice. When Erithene finished, her compound eyes moved briefly to Dara with an expression that was, as near as Dara could interpret, something like acknowledgement. Not gratitude. Not warmth. Just the particular look of someone who has updated their calculations. Velith accepted the recommendation with a formal nod. She waited while the guards moved to their positions. She waited while the chamber completed its procedural functions with the slow, certain gravity of institutions that have done this before and will do it again. Then, she looked at Orzval. "My guardian's security notes," she said. "All 17 points. I want a full remediation plan by the next ship cycle." Orzval's carapace held its color. "Yes, your radiance." And a formal amendment to her station designation. "She is not temporary." The word landed like something physical. Dara felt it, the weight of a title being placed down in a room where titles meant everything. Orzval turned his head, precisely and deliberately, and looked at her. Not with the dismissal of the first day. Not with the suppressed fury of the council sessions. With assessment. The genuine kind. He said nothing. He turned back to the Queen Apparent and dipped his head in the formal acknowledgement of a command received. The council ended. The chamber cleared. Velith remained in her chair for a moment after everyone else had left, which Dara had learned meant she was thinking through consequences, a habit the young queen had apparently developed as a survival mechanism before she'd ever known she'd need to survive. Finally, she stood. She walked toward the door, and, as she passed Dara, she stopped. "You knew it was Cerevel on the first day," she said. "It wasn't a question. I suspected. Why didn't you act on the first day?" Dara looked down at her, this child who carried a dynasty, who had read security notes in the dark while everyone assumed she was sleeping, who had sealed an escape route before the man had thought to use it. Because suspicion isn't enough. Because you needed the council to see it, not just me. Because the point wasn't for me to solve it. She paused. The point was for you two. Velith's antennae held very still. Then, she walked through the door. Dara followed, 2 paces back, to the left, eyes already moving through the corridor, reading angles, noting shadows, cataloguing the small particular shapes of a ship that was now, for the first time, beginning to feel like somewhere she was meant to be. Somewhere ahead, the stars moved past the viewport in long cold streaks, and the vessel of unbroken sky carried its queen forward into whatever came next. Dara kept pace. She always did.